Some of you have been here for the past couple of sessions that we've had where we've been talking about the origins of the Hebrew Bible and how that has come into being. We're going to pause that just for a little bit today. We might even get into some of it again. But I thought today is a good day to let's dig in a little bit deeper into the history of what is going on in Israel, Palestine, and maybe have some hard conversations around that. This is a new setup for us, obviously. It's much easier than doing the projector and all that stuff, and the tech team is amazing. Thank you guys for doing that. So I'm hoping that those of you who are watching at home can see what's going on here, because I know sometimes when you pick up a screen with another screen, there's some flickering things that are going on. For that reason, I'll see if I can, if you want it, I will email out to you the links to some of these things, so if you want to see it again. It'll be fine, you think? Okay. 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 It'll be fine. And I also have, I don't have, well, if you want to reach me, you can't. I'm going to try in the future to have my cell phone on me so that people can text me questions from home if they want to. You can also text me questions if you would like, but I'm just going to call on you here and you'll have to talk anyway. So it strikes me that the stuff that's going on in the Middle East is quite complicated, and at the same time, it's not very complicated at all. And I thought a good starting place for us would be to get a history of what's going on there. And Vox has put together some videos that have just kind of short histories on that kind of thing. I found it to be fairly good. And then I want to get into some things, some concepts like implicit bias, especially checking our own biases when we take in information. And then I want to get into some voices that maybe have not been majority voices, to start listening to some of those things and have a conversation about that. So part of what I plan on doing today is to first make the issue more complex than you thought it was before, and then we're going to simplify it again, okay? All right, so, yep. Let's watch this first, see if it will help to explain some of the things, and then I am not an expert on this. I do know quite a bit, but I am not an expert. So maybe, I don't know. I don't know if I know more than you, right? There may be some experts here amongst us, or some people who have done more study into this than I have. My background that I do have with that area is I know quite a bit about the Lutheran Church in the Holy Lands. And there was a time where we had a cousin who worked for the Lutheran Church in the Holy Lands. She was an assistant to the bishop there, and she would write letters back to us, telling us what it was like living. Was she in Bethlehem at the time? Very near Bethlehem. But she often talked about the relationships between the Israeli government and the Palestinians that she lived side by side with. She was living with Palestinian Christians. So that, I mean, there's lots of dynamics that are going on with that, but we got a lot of firsthand accounts of things that were happening from somebody that I trust, right? It's different when you get reports of things happening and you're like, do I know this person? I don't know this person. I don't know if I can trust this person, right? But let's go with the history first. I think this is about a 10-minute video, so I hope it will answer a lot of questions to begin with, but it'll give us a jumping off point.
Myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed the Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as the best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there.
No fees or minimums and no overdraft fees.
Yeah,
Another reason
this is a
banking with Capital
YouTube
One
thing,
is
so you're going to
facing
have to
easier
watch
decision
commercials.
limits. We need a clutch hit. There.
I thought I had gotten rid of the commercial because I went past it. There you go.
After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling in farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. But the Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, mainly because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened to transform the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the U.S. brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of the
Stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, where the Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycott. It soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, the far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years. The big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. But the second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even withdrawn. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work, and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence. They most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence, there's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
All right. Very well explained? Okay. Yeah. Kate, did that answer some of your questions? Okay. Yeah. So these things try to be as unbiased as they can be, but there is no way to completely separate yourself from bias. We have to recognize that the United States is a stated ally of Israel, and a lot of the information that we have gotten through our media is going to be biased towards Israel. So we have to know that coming into it. Debbie has this worksheet that she is teaching the kids today about implicit bias. And she gave me this worksheet and she said, look at it and let's find how many triangles are in this picture. Here, I've got a few. Share. I only have a few more here, so you guys can share here. You can see it? So how many triangles are there? What say you? Yell it out. 8. 8. How many do you think, Charlie? 5? I don't know if you can see at home, this is the thing. 10? 10? 8. What if I told you you're all wrong? 0. There are none. There are no triangles. But you have to separate it, right? As they are there. Why did you think that there were triangles? Because I asked you to look for triangles, right? Right? Yeah, yeah. There's no line there, though. There's no actual triangles there. There are none. So, okay, but we're not going to argue about the triangles or no triangles, right? What is the point of this little exercise? Right, if we are primed to see something, we are more likely to see that thing, right? And so then it gets very, very hard, it gets very, very challenging to be able to see a different perspective. Very hard. So we have to check those biases at the door in order to understand something that is maybe more complex, right? And here are my rules for myself. If every media outlet is reporting the exact same thing in the exact same way, check it, verify it, get other sources, right? When news stuff comes out and there is kind of a line that has been happening amongst especially news commentators, right? I go to the Associated Press. I get information from reporters who are on the ground, and I also do something else. I check because in this day and age of media, you can go directly to the source of the people that it's happening to, right? We have access to that kind of information now. They are going to also have some implicit bias within how they see a particular thing, but it's important to understand they have it, we have it, there are different ways, and perhaps the empathetic thing to do is to try to understand why someone sees something in a particular way. So something that I do for myself when complicated things like this come up, I always look for voices that are coming from the minority, that are coming from people who have been oppressed, that are coming from non-white experiences to kind of decentralize my own experience, right? And for a long time, we have been taught that Arab means bad. Arab means terrorist, right? And that line of thinking has gotten us nowhere. Nothing has changed in our war on terrorism. So I know a lot of people who are Arab, and my experience of them is they were just like us. So it makes me ask the question, what is my implicit bias? What biases have been fed to me through media so that I tend to see a particular situation in a particular way? So I'm going to show you a creator on TikTok he is a scholar, and I really appreciate his voice, especially when, like, Black Lives Matter, when that movement was kind of starting to take off. He became a person who educated me on what some Black voices were saying, why it was an important movement to happen. He has some interesting things to say about the conflict that's happening. And I want to see if I can get... His name is The Conscious Lee.
What you made is not it. And I didn't stop.
Hold on a
and
second.
Started and delete. I was hesitant to talk about the Israeli occupation of Palestine and what's going on there currently. But Obama, this tweet you made is not it. And I didn't stop and started and deleted and did this video so many times that I'm going to just give you a disclaimer. I acknowledge that this conversation requires a lot of complexity.
Uh-oh. I don't know where our internet went. Technology is great until it doesn't work. Let me get out of this and see if I can start it again.
I was hesitant to talk about the Israeli occupation of Palestine and what's going on there currently.
Let's see if it gets past that part.
This tweet you made is not it. And I didn't stop and started and deleted and did this video so many times that I'm going to just give you a disclaimer. I acknowledge that this conversation requires a lot of complexity and compassion because a lot of us out west, including myself, has been educated through a lens that is very one-sided. You see what I'm saying? With that being said, we should always already have energy when innocent civilians are being slaughtered. The last disclaimer I want to make is words are important. And how we construct narratives with those words usually dictate who we care about, how we care about them, and who we don't give a damn about. Let's get into this tweet. Obama said all Americans
I apologize, he might have some language.
By the brazen terrorist attack on Israel and the slaughter of innocent civilians. Innocent civilians. We're going to get to that part back later on. We grieve for those who died pray for the safe return of those who've been held hostage, and stand squarely alongside our ally, Israel, as it dismantles Hamas. As we support Israel's right to defend itself against terror, we must keep striving for a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Let's start with unpackaging these two things from the tweet already. Being outraged by the slaughter of innocent civilians and having the right to defend yourself against terror. Yes, he ended the tweet with talking about Israeli and Palestinian everlasting peace, but he talked about Israel having the right to defend itself, but didn't talk about Palestine that way. Remember, I said that words are important. They construct narratives and impact who we care about and how we care about them. Here we have a map that's able to historically illustrate how Palestine, which is depicted in green, had territory in 1917. And as we move through history, that green becomes smaller and smaller. Now, I think, you see what I'm saying, the settler colonizing of your land means that you should have the ability to defend yourself from it. When you dig through the archive, you'll see that Palestinians have been going to the United Nations trying all type of ways to get their land back. Whether we're talking about doing peaceful rallies and protests, or we talk about lawsuits, or we're talking about trying to get legislation from the United Nations. We recognize that the ability for the Palestinians to defend themselves has not been one that has been acknowledged by the world. And speaking of acknowledging by the world, here's a map depicting the international response to the attacks on Israel. And I want you to acknowledge how much one color that you see compared to the other color. We see that the turquoise color is the condemnation / support for Israel. We see the yellow is calls for de-escalation, and we see that this little orange, red color is support for Palestine. How much support for Palestine do you see in the map? Do you know that this depicts, this right here illustrates how we understand terror and terrorism when it comes to the Palestinian people? Islamophobia is defined as the dislike or prejudice against Islam or Muslims, especially as a political force. And when it comes to that word terrorism, when we start talking about anybody in proximity to the Muslim communities, populations, my ears, they start to perk up. You see, my spidey sense start to tingle. Just like a black person in America, you start talking about criminals or thugs and relationship to me, and people that look like me, I know something's up with it. This idea of terrorism, you see what I'm saying, only being used in relationship to the Palestinian is very suspect. I want y'all to think about that Cat Williams special. He was talking about how that word insurgent is used to kind of depict and bamboozle people.
They pimps. They got us over there thinking we ain't really killing real people over there. They don't never act like it's real people. They don't never say today we killed 6 men and 4 women and 3 children. They use a word can't readily identify. Today we killed a group of insurgents. And brothers be at home like, I don't even know no insurgents. You kill all them. I don't have not one insurgent friend.
Yes, language is important. When I say it though, let's really get more context from this communications expert. Take it away.
And that is my area of expertise, which is communications. And I want to talk about 2 words. And those words are killed and the word death. And I want to talk about how language shapes narratives. When we talk about a conflict, an armed conflict, people make the assumption that both sides are equally as tooled and have the exact same resources. And not only that, but that the risks and the liabilities are the same. So when we see the word conflict, we make assumptions about power balances and not power imbalances. So when we have international news media, particularly news outlets in the West, characterizing the casualties from one group as from them being killed versus another group from them just dying dead, it always sends up a little flare in the back of my mind. Because this is the difference between active voice and passive voice. Israelis are being killed while Palestinians just die. Utilization of the word killed is an action word. It requires an actor versus somebody that is acted upon. Whereas the word dead is just a state of being. We're by and large not looking for perpetrators. We're by and large not looking for context. Death is just what happens, right? And I'm always worried when I see a political narrative being orchestrated to present one group of people for whom the consequences of being alive is merely death. Like, that's just what happens. Particularly when we already represent these groups of people as equally tooled and capable of violence. I want you all to pay attention to the words being used, okay? And be very careful with the words you are using. And never assume that history starts the moment you start paying attention. And I want to get serious with you for a second, and you know I enjoy my communications videos. But the swiftness with which America, Biden, and celebrities and influencers all so quickly and so swiftly aligned in anti-Palestinian arguments and narratives from the bottom of my heart fucking terrifies me.
Sorry
And
about
I know
that.
this is not new,
It's TikTok.
but there's something different this time. And I can't pinpoint my finger on it, but it absolutely terrifies me.
And if you're asking yourself, how does language impact how we understand life and who we care about? Here's the human cost from 2008 to 2023. Here are the Israeli deaths versus the Palestinian deaths. Now, we recognize that all death is bad, but we acknowledge that these two sides is not equal, that there's one side experiencing way more bloodshed than the other. And this where Obama's tweet comes back.
I wanted to go back so you can see that a little bit better. He's standing in front of it, but that is the difference between, and further down on that graph, it all looks about the same for the Israeli side. So there is clearly a disproportionate number of deaths, Palestinian deaths, Israeli deaths. Yeah, from 2008 to 2023. Well, the governments keep track of them. Both Palestine and Israel. Yeah.
Versus the Palestinian deaths. Now we recognize
that is from the United Nations.
That these two sides is not equal. That there's one side experiencing way more bloodshed than the other. And this where Obama's tweet comes back in. All Americans should be horrified and outraged against terrorist attacks on innocent civilians. This right here illustrates the airstrikes that's happened against innocent civilians, that depicts how many Palestinians and how many Israelis has been taken out by airstrikes since 2008. We see the red is the Palestinian.
All right, the red is the Palestinians, the purple are the Israeli. And that last one is from the most recent, and that has now changed since this was done earlier in the week.
Well, right here, you see what I'm saying, is Israeli. We see the trend right here. But let's get back to these airstrikes. Obama had 10 times more airstrikes than President Bush. And according to 2018 reports, Obama launched 186 drone strikes to Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, predominantly Muslim spaces. Remember Islamophobia I was talking about? But President Trump beat him out with 233 in his first 3 years. So when we talk about all Americans being outraged about the loss of innocent civilians, does that only apply to non-Muslims, or you see what I'm saying? Now let's sprinkle some more context in there. Hamas was established in 1987. You see what I'm saying? So the fact that we have so many individuals trying to structure the Israeli occupation and what Israel does to Palestinians as just mere resistance to Hamas, it's cap. You see what I'm saying? Not only is it deceptive.
Cap means false.
And I know when we hear about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we tend to not hear from Palestinian voices. But we got something for that. Don't take it away, bro.
In light of recent events, here's a few things I think everybody should know about Palestine and what's going on right now. Number one, this is not a conflict. A conflict implies that these are two equal parties fighting for a legitimate claim. This is in fact colonialism, where one side has extensive funding and military power with a history of oppression, which is Israel, and the other side is literally fighting for their human rights. This is Palestine. Number two, Gaza for the past 20 years has been blockaded by the Israeli military by land and sea. Nothing can come in, nothing can come out, and all of the resources, including food, water, electricity, everything has been controlled by the Israeli military. Not only that, but it's been bombed repeatedly over the past 20 years, causing tens of thousands of casualties, including women and children, and important infrastructure has been demolished, including schools and hospitals, and much more. Number three, you're going to see this word used to describe Palestinian and the Palestinian struggle very often in the coming weeks. I want you guys to take that with a massive grain of salt, and always remember that Malcolm X Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela were all considered this word by the oppressive governments they fought against. You're gonna take anything from this video, take this. Resisting your oppressors that have been oppressing you for 70 years is not terror. Denying people human rights, that's terror. And as always, free Palestine.
All right. So did that make things more complex for you? It gave you a different perspective, for sure. Like, some of you might not have even known that there are people who think like this, that understand this conflict in this particular way. So share with me, if you will, what's fighting in your head right now. Hold on a second. They can't hear you on there. It'll just be like this blank airspace.
One thing that's fighting in my head, somewhere along the line, there was a mention of we have feelings negative towards Arabs. Mm-hmm. My negative feeling toward Arabs is because Israel did not come to the United States and use planes to kill innocent victims and do a lot of damage here on our land. Mm-hmm. But they were Arabs. Mm-hmm. They were trained, they came here, they trained on our land, and they did it to us. So I do have a feeling against, now I know they're not all the same, but that group came from Arab.
Sure. So an extremist Arabs have painted a picture for you of a lot of Arabs.
No, but my prejudice against Arabs is I'm cautious now of Arab men. Because those are the ones that came here and did such damage.
Okay.
So where I didn't have any prejudice at all, now if I come against an Arab man, I will question myself, what are his motives?
Okay.
Might not be fair now. I'm not talking about the whole world, but if they come into my world and I see them in a college or doing something, and I think, and because of that prejudice, it does make me think, are they straight up or are they planning something else? Because 9/11 was horrific. And it came here. They came here and did that. We didn't do something to them. They came here.
Oh, that's interesting. We didn't do something to them. There are many people who would beg to differ on that front. And that, let me explain this to you. And the easiest example that I can give, and my mother is here, so she can back me up on this. When I was a kid, I used to torment my brother. I would harass him endlessly because I wanted a reaction out of him. I wanted his attention. He was older than me, right? I just wanted him to react to me in some way, right? And he would put up with my crap, even physically hitting him, physically doing things to him. And the second that he touched me, I'd be like, Mom! And what did Mom do? Scolded him. Yeah. You don't touch girls. You don't hit girls. Which, that was an important lesson for him to learn. However, I created a terrorist. You know what I mean? And the United States and other kind of dominant world powers have histories of colonizing areas and oppressing areas, and creating the atmospheres in which terrorists, their only option because they don't have power, is to act violently, right? What's really interesting, they don't mention it in this, is that Hamas was funded by Israel. Isn't that interesting? At their very formation, they were funded by Israel. They might not have known.
But
Yeah.
why?
Because
Why?
it was a better, why? Because they thought it was a better option than the PLO. Yeah. Who? What? Who is they? The people that we saw here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, which is really, really interesting. Like, do you see how, like, complex all of this is? But here's where it's not complex. When you have a group of people, such as the Palestinians, that have, you saw that video where it had the map of their space being dwindled down. One of the things that was the most compelling and eye-opening for me 17 years ago, whenever it was that we were getting those letters, is my cousin talking about all of these checkpoints that had to happen, and she was in the West Bank, so there were all of these checkpoints that they had to get to, and like certain Palestinians couldn't get to work. They would wake up in the morning and they wouldn't know if they could get to where it is that they needed to get to, and she could go and she could get right through. Right? So it was an unequal application of law. And we see in the Gaza Strip, like there's such restriction of movement. The Israeli government controls what food, what water, what electricity, all of those things that can be utilized in that area. And how long can you live? And you saw they talked about 40% unemployment, and went from being a fairly, well-off state to having 40% unemployment in these really harsh conditions, and these really, really restricted movements in and out of that area. How long can you live in that situation and not create terrorists, right?
I will say this. I understand, and I did not know these kind of restrictions were on the Palestinians. That is new knowledge. But my answer is, okay, then you go to war with the country that's doing this to you. You demand that they stand up, but you don't go around and kill innocent people like 9/11 and like the people that were just killed last Saturday.
I think we can agree that any time that innocent civilians are put into the middle of this and they are victims of this, it's horrible. And it's illegal. It's against international law.
Right. But I will also say, this information is very good to have because it does give you a different perspective.
Yeah. But here's something else to keep in mind. What you say is well and good, but keep the power differential in mind. The Israeli government, the army, is one of the most well-funded, and they are a nuclear power in the world, right? The Palestinians have no army. They have no means of governing themselves. They have like zero gross, GDP. They can't. It's totally unequal. And when you have that unequal power, it's not surprising. Like their army, which are a few fighters, and the Israeli army, like they would just be completely obliterated. So like I kind of understand why they do those terroristic tactics. I don't agree with them, but I understand them at least.
But don't you think if they do the terroristic and they are that much smaller, don't they know that they're going to come back that much harder?
I think they probably do.
But it's worth it.
And so the Palestinian people have said, please don't do this, right? Like, this is something that we have to figure out in our own minds how to separate the actions of Hamas from the Palestinian people, while still understanding how something like Hamas could be created, right? We at least understand it, even if we don't agree with their tactics, right? And we also have to separate the Israeli people from the Israeli government and army, right? Yeah. Oh,
I found this really interesting because, I mean, I think, I wish we could go back in time because I know, like, when the Holocaust ended, there were so many Jews that felt so disconnected from going home in Europe,
yeah.
and they didn't feel welcome in America. So they went to Palestine. They created that land. And I know we can't go back in time, and I wish it could have been done differently where they didn't just take the Palestinian land. And I think, I understand why they needed land at the time, but I personally, like, after seeing these videos, like, Israel is becoming what they fought so hard against for. Like, I'm not saying comparing it to the Holocaust, but they're controlling other people's food, water, electric. That's what the Germans did. That's exactly what they went through. And the fact that they don't realize that is appalling, and it breaks my heart. And I just wish, like, someone, and I know Israel has been everybody's baby because they went through the Holocaust. I've seen it with every president. John McCain, when he was running for president, he was like, I want you to know, his big running campaign was, I will always protect Israel. I will support Israel.
And it's really interesting, right? Because there are a couple of things going on with that. One, Israel is not Jewish people. They are two separate things. There are Zionists who are Jewish, who believe that they need to have a Jewish state. And then there are a large number of Jewish people who believe that they're never supposed to have a Jewish state, and that what is going on here is wrong, and have expressed the same kind of pain that you're talking about. So, like, a really interesting thing to do is, like, go and look up what a Zionist is. Not every Jewish person is a Zionist. And there are a lot more, and I'm especially seeing rabbis who are speaking up against that kind of propaganda. Here's another really interesting layer to this. There are some evangelical Christians who are Zionists, but at the same time, they are anti-Semitic. Why? Any guesses why? Well, they want all the Jews gone. They want the Jews gone, right? But they think that Jesus will come back once Israel is established as the state and the Palestinians are gone. There is absolutely no biblical evidence for this. This is some propaganda that has been built up around the rapture, which that also was like a theology that was created in the 1950s or something like that by a Scottish pastor. And they came up with all these theories. It's nuts. And if you have questions about that, keep them, because I think we're going to, for Lent, dive deeper into that for rapture stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I believe that a lot of this mess is because they carved up the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Because outsiders told the people who lived there what was going to happen.
Yes.
And I think that's the root.
Oh, we should probably, yeah. I agree. It is the root of all of this mess. Right, and that's the problem. The same thing is true of the United States. We're here now. We did the same thing to Native Americans. that they did, but we're here now. So people are just finally now starting to kind of wake up to that and realize how much harm that we have done. But we're here now. Like, we all have to figure out a way to live together and move forward. And so I think we're not going to find answers to this by looking at the past. We'll find answers to understand how we got here by looking at the past, but we have to do something different and new going forward. And my hope and my prayer is that we figure that out before 2 million Palestinians are killed in Gaza, right? And I really hope that Hamas de-escalates what they're doing as well, because all it is going to do is add fuel to the fire. So, when you go home today and you are listening to different news reports, start paying attention to the language. Start paying attention to, particularly when you hear someone speaking about any human being as being something other than a human being, a man, a woman, a child. Pay attention to that language that she had us talk about, killed and died. Pay attention to your news sources and see if you can see the bias in it, right? Then allow yourself to take a step back from it and do some searching on your own. You're like, okay, there was a story here. It was interesting. It triggered something in me. I'm fearful of this, that, or the other thing. If they're sharing it here, there has to be backup reports of it somewhere else, right? So start searching for that. You're going to find things in the Associated Press, right? You should, in this day and age, be able to find footage of a particular thing showing what it is. And I would say, when you hear outlandish claims on either side, like the one that was really, that really took me aback was the reports that there were babies whose heads had been cut off. That didn't happen. It was false. It has been verified that that was false. But people reported it. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. But if your news sources that you are hearing have a lot of bias in it, take a step back from those news sources. It's really important to do that. The other thing is, many of our 24-hour news stations are designed to keep you afraid and to keep you glued in. And we talked about this on our Thursday night Bible study. How many times have you tuned in at the beginning of the hour and they say, we're going to talk about the beheading of children at the end of the hour or whatever, right? And then you have to stay, you want to hear that story, so you have to stay tuned in for that whole hour or whole half hour to get to that story at the end. How many commercials do you see between here and there? How many drugs do you convince yourself that you need to be on from the beginning of the hour to the end, right? Right? So many. I've diagnosed myself with so many things. I just needed to stop eating so many carbs. I mean, you know. Was this, yeah. Oh.
I don't like to plug any news source, but I listen to Democracy Now!
Okay.
Because it focuses on human rights around the world,
Sure.
and they get interviews from both sides. So
that's great.
But,
yeah,
but you still have to look at it with a jaundiced eye.
I would say probably some of Democracy Now! I have seen a little bit of coverage with that. Public television has some pretty good news reporting, news programs. NPR has some pretty good, fairly unbiased. They're always going to sneak in. Everything is going to sneak in. What was really interesting to me, MSNBC has had 3 Arab reporters, and one of them was sharing this different perspective, right? He is now off the bench. The 2 other are now off the bench. But something that I wanted to get into that you brought up is, how did we get to this point where we're so pro-Israel, right? There's footage of Biden in, I think it's the 80s or 90s, saying something to the effect of, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create an Israel. Why? Because the Middle East is a very destabilized area because of the dividing up of land and things that colonial type powers did without their consent. And we need to have an ally in the Middle East who has nuclear power to be able to keep the area under control. Right?
Yeah, but meanwhile, Russians and Saudi Arabia control the price of oil. It doesn't matter how much.
We've completely messed ourselves up. Oil. All of this is over oil. All of this is over oil.
And I owned oil and gas plant for 20 years.
Yeah.
They not
My first husband and I owned 120 acres of land in Ohio where there was oil and gas underneath, coal and water. And it's amazing what they do to that land. That's why the population keeps shrinking there, because they discourage any kind of businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So young people have to leave.
Hmm.
And that's what happens.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it hurts everyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, all of this geopolitical stuff it's complicated, and then you look at it, you're like, it's really not complicated. Like, very kind of transparent. Yeah. Yeah. Can you take that?
Why don't you explain what the Lutheran Church is doing in Israel?
Yeah. So, yeah, the Lutheran Church in Israel, in Palestine. So, if you were to like think about this situation, you would think, oh, there's only Jewish people and Muslim people in the area. It's not true. There are Christians, and there is the Lutheran Christian Church there. There are also other denominations that are there as well. With the Lutheran World Federation, they have established a hospital, Augusta Victoria Hospital, that serves primarily Palestinian people in the West Bank. And they are the place that people go for dialysis, for cancer treatment, for a number of other things. They're kind of like experts in that particular area for those things. So we have been, with our money through Lutheran World Federation, have been supporting Augusta Victoria Hospital. And I am sure right now they are overrun with patients. So they haven't put any updates out there. They haven't updated their online presence since like 2021. It looks like, oh, the pandemic hit and we got burnt out. Kind of a thing. So I don't know exactly what's happening on the ground there. I have been looking for updates from the Lutheran World Federation to see what's going on. And, you know, we may soon have kind of like a disaster response, like, you know, for that area to keep supplies heading into that area. So, yeah. Do you know of anything else that I'm missing? That's the big thing. Yep. It is. Yep. Yeah, and it's, yeah. Yep. Yeah. So, and that's in the West Bank, if you remember that, that's the area where there's all sorts of Israeli settlements that have like come in and kind of infringed upon the Palestinian area. And so there's like strange walls and borders and checkpoints and things all around the area. It's very strange. So, yeah. Did I make it more complex for you? Did I make it more simple for you? Did I complexify it and then simplify it for you? Okay. Well, good luck as you navigate. I tend to find for myself that watching mainstream media is not super helpful for my mental health. I would much prefer to read articles off of the Associated Press, and I still listen to NPR. There are some people that they'll listen to Al Jazeera, which is another good place to get information, and they're biased in another way, but I think it's important to get that perspective because we don't get that here. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, and right now it's interesting too, watching the BBC. I used to go to the BBC, but not on this issue because where did this conflict come from, right? There's a lot of implicit bias with the BBC. So, yeah. And then you have to reconcile yourself with this. We might not know the complete truth of what's going on. We might not ever have the big picture. And we're just going to have to be okay with that, right? But what can we do? We pray for peace. We take action when there is action to be taken. And go from there. Yeah. We're not powerless, which is good. Shall we end in the Lord's Prayer together? Yeah, we absolutely can. Let's do the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.